Hello, Jim. Zons.
Greetings.
I see that Mike Kinnear decided it was too cold outside.
All right, it's 7 o'clock. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming, attending, and anyone that is listening to us this evening. This is the Dunn County Board of Supervisors, March 29th, 2021 meeting. It's a special budget meeting. And that's all that's on the agenda is capital improvement budget items. We will start with the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, we'll have the clerk call the roll.
Supervisor Johnson,
Here.
Chairman Bartlett,
Here.
Supervisor Headland,
Here.
Supervisor Score,
Here.
Supervisor Steen,
Here.
Supervisor Zons,
Present.
Supervisor Gary Bjork,
Here.
Supervisor Maves,
Here.
Supervisor Quinn,
Here.
Supervisor Rogers,
Here.
Supervisor Anderson,
Here.
Supervisor Kinnear,
Here.
Supervisor Crumry,
Excused.
Supervisor Calabrese,
Here.
Supervisor Keeter,
Here.
Supervisor Vogel,
Here.
Supervisor McCullough, Supervisor Story,
Here.
Supervisor Vandermeulen,
Here.
Supervisor Niehoff, Supervisor Morehouse,
Here.
Supervisor Kennedy, Supervisor Tripp,
Here.
Supervisor Prochnow,
Here.
Supervisor Jensen,
Here.
Supervisor Larry Bjork, Supervisor Bauer,
Here.
Supervisor Leno,
Here.
Supervisor Hartung.
Here.
We have a quorum. So we'll move right into number 4, the 5-year capital improvement plans. And I think we'll hear from our Chief Financial Officer and our County Manager, starting out with Mr. Miller.
Thank you. You have a staff report in the materials that we sent you that lays out what we're trying to do tonight and kind of the background of it. As you all know, we adopt an annual budget that generally includes some capital expenditures every year. But we have always tended to handle those capital expenditures on a year-by-year basis, which means some years, depending on what we're doing, there's quite a lot of capital expenditures. You think about the construction of the neighbors or the move from downtown out here to the community services building. And we tend to borrow for those large capital expenditures. Other years, it's relatively lean. But the result of this approach, the take them as they come, doesn't allow us the time to really think about our capital needs and approach them in a thoughtful and coordinated way that smooths out the peaks and the valleys that we have typically encountered. realizing that or recognizing that we wanted to avoid some of the difficulty and volatility that's associated with that annual approach, or that just looking at 1 year ahead. We came to the board, staff came to the board last year and advocated for the idea of a 5-year capital improvement plan where we would look at projects that are needed, capital projects, new buildings, new major equipment expenditures, et cetera, that are needed, or improvements to existing buildings that are needed in the next 5 years. And the idea is that each year we would identify those that we're going to prioritize for the coming year and then lay out a projection for the next 4 years after that. And every year it would be a rolling process. That's part of the annual budget process. It would be what we would handle first in the first part of the year, and then handle the levy in the second half of the year as for a total approach. So to that end, we reached out to all the managers of all the county departments and asked them to come up with a list of capital improvements that they would be seeking or feel they needed, anything over $10,000 for the next 5 years. And the CFO, Keith Stray, gathered all those together. And then we went to the executive committee last month and presented different approaches that we could take with respect to a capital improvements plan. Everything from no borrowing to considerable borrowing. I mean, we literally have in front of us the gamut. We could try to finance everything all at once. It would be a huge expenditure, not a very wise approach. Or we could say we're not going to do anything, which just pushes everything down the road and makes the needs more greater. They make a greater need and they put a greater emphasis. And that's also not a wise approach. So the executive committee looked at over various alternatives and has come up with a recommendation as to an approach for this. And it is with that recommendation in line then that Keith has gathered all the materials that the rest of your packet is. And I'm going to turn it over to Keith at this point to let him walk you through what we have and ask you for what we're looking for in the way of input tonight.
Good evening, everyone. Certainly, this is not a small project to take on, but it's definitely important in that credit rating agencies are looking at local units of government and recommending it's a very good business practice to be doing multi-year financial planning. Credit rating agencies are not far from actually maybe holding it against those that aren't planning like this, partly because it's indicating to the market investors in bonds for the county that we're keeping up on our infrastructure and not letting it get too far behind. So this is a good process, as we talked about last year, and it's recommended from multiple organizations we all work with. So in starting out the presentation, before I go through the details that were presented in your agenda packet, I do want to do a very, very quick high-level comparison to the information received last year. For those that attended the workshop and took part in it last year, you may recall that the total requests were just over $62 million. In today's presentation, the requests this year are $46.5 million. So that's a $15.5 million reduction. So what happened? Largely, the significant part of that is removal of solid waste and recycling requests. They had some very significant needs for facilities. With that operation going out of operation, certainly those aren't included anymore. There were also some reductions for projects that were funded this year, the judicial roof project and other things like that. Some of our infrastructure, IT in particular, technology projects, a good chunk of them were covered by additional grant money received in 2020 and a small amount in 2021. So this just really reflects adjustments as we go forward year over year as funding opportunities, grant and otherwise come along to finance this program. So with that, I just wanted to give that quick snapshot in comparison to the information from last year. So I'm going to bring up on screen and share with my screen the attachments that were included. Can everybody see that? Oh, geez, I didn't hit share. I'm sorry about that. Let's see here. Share screen. And there we go. There, now we got it. Okay. This first one, let's see here. Let me go to full screen mode. Nope, I don't like that. There we go. This first one is more or less is a historical reference to what the county board during the budget process worked through from all the requests for the 2021 budget. If you look at the middle column dated 7/29/2020, those are all the projects that were requested right here. These are the projects that were initially requested and presented to the county board for consideration before these requests went to standing committees and ultimately the executive committee and county board for final approval. That totaled $9.2 million and all the funding sources over in the right column. Then the second column here at 7.1 million is what was presented to executive committee as the budget process progressed in October 7th. And that's where we landed, or very close to that with the adopted budget. The next page in the packet shows you the funding sources, again, for all of those. And again, this shows that through the budget process and through adjustments that were made, the requests were reduced by $2.1 million. Not unusual for a process like this during budget, because sometimes the initial asks need a little more refinement, a little more discussion. And sometimes there's opportunities that come out through this process where we can combine projects or do other things to move them along at a cheaper price. Then down in the yellow section here, these are all the projects that were financed by debt. The final approved amount was $1.3 million. So that's what we will be borrowing later this year. So let me go to page 3 now. Mr. Miller did mention that we had discussion with the executive committee in February about different scenarios. And what we did was we took a look at different things, from scenario 1 being a frozen annual tax levy and no new debt. Now, realistically, if you're going to keep up on all the infrastructure that we have, that's maybe not going to be the best approach. If you look at that, the total requests for 2022 to 26 equal $37.4 million in round numbers. If you look to the column to the right, you only generate $620,000. So you have a little over $3 million deficit under that scenario. If you bring it down further, we went with a recommendation to executive committee, and they endorsed a frozen tax levy. We've been operating like most or all local units of government for the last decade plus in a frozen tax levy. So we're recommending a frozen levy. We're struggling to even meet operational increases with the little amount that we're able to raise tax levy. So we recommended that's a best business practice in this case for planning. So all of these scenarios have a frozen levy, tax levy, but then we walked it through different borrowing options, 2.5 million, 3 million, 3.5, so on. Keeping in mind that when you're trying to put together a plan like this, you also want to look at the total amount of outstanding debt. And you don't generally, unless you have to, try to borrow more annually than what you're paying off in principal. So the 3 million achieves that comfortably. But yet if you look at that, it still puts the county in a position of not funding, let's see here, roughly $21.8 million of projects of requested. So it's not unusual to not fully fund, because there can be adjustments, and some of these estimates in outer years can be adjusted, but that's pretty significant. But on the flip side, there's reality. We can only borrow so much. We can only do so much. Some projects can be phased or extended, but this certainly at least shows you're making progress towards maintaining your infrastructure and moving forward. Let's see here. All right, I'm gonna go to the next page. And rotate view. Sorry, folks, that's why we hand out or send out the hard copy too for your electronic copy so you can follow along on your end too. There we go. All right, after we put together those scenarios and the executive committee did endorse scenario 4 at 3 million a year borrowing, I did the analysis on here's our current annual principal payments on our current debt. Here would be the additional principal payments required for new debt, $270,000 for the borrowing we're going to do this year, anticipated, and then the 3 million a year, the additional 300,000 per year, assuming a 10-year note. And then here's your annual estimated principal if this plan's adopted. So annually, you're paying 3.5 million in principal for 21, and it's going up every year after that. Then if you take that out and compare or take that information and include that into the total outstanding debt to see where you're at the end of every year, here's your outstanding debt as it stood at the beginning of the year, your principal payments, the new debt issued. So that shows we gained ground, we reduced our outstanding debt, and every year after that, we're still at 3 million annual borrowing, reducing it. So you go from at the end of 2020 or beginning of 2021 at 35.2 million, you're down to 24.1 million outstanding at the end of 26. So this just represents, depending on what your goal is for debt management, how fast you want to pay down the debt. Obviously, if you take this 3 million out, that's going to go a whole lot. The total over 5 years is over the 6-year period here is 16.3 million. So you could be that much further along, but at what price of infrastructure falling behind on repairs?
If I can jump in here, what I want to do is basically reiterate what Keith just said. So the approach that was endorsed by executive at its meeting last month tries to strike a balance in terms of raising the funds we need through borrowing to allow some of these many projects to take place and the increase to our total debt. We've talked before about how Dunn County is in the top 1/4 of all counties in Wisconsin for per capita debt burden. And we're very much aware of that. Of course, part of that is driven by the fact that we've got a population of about 45,000, and we have had some expensive capital projects, most notably the neighbors. But as I said in my early remarks, you do want to strike a balance because the alternative, we simply said we want to work down that debt, is that we put off necessary capital improvements that one day the chickens come home to roost and we must address. And then we find ourselves with the likelihood of a very large bill coming due in terms of new debt at increased rates, because every year, generally the cost of construction, the cost of materials is going up. So defer is not the answer. We can't keep kicking the can down the road. We have to address some of these things. And the scenario number 4 on the one sheet that you saw, which projects 3 million in borrowing every year, allows us to slowly work down our total debt burden while still allowing us to address needed capital improvements, some, but not all. And that's where the real trick will come in, deciding which of those we are going to fund every year with that amount of borrowing. So I'll turn back to Keith. You're muted.
Sorry, I didn't want to have the echo factor being right next to each other. And that was a great segue. I was going to open it up at this point just for any questions on the materials I presented here so far. It's fairly technical, but it's intended to be summary in nature. Really, the philosophy here, Paul hit it on the head there, that essentially you're trying to strike that balance. That last sheet that I presented, attachment 3, principal payments exceed what we're issuing for new debt. And that was a goal we've heard from the county board in general terms, that, they're not necessarily happy being at the level we're at. So how can we effectively move forward and get projects done, but in a meaningful manner where we're still working down that outstanding debt? So I'll open that up for questions before we dive into any of the detail.
Supervisor Bjork?
Thank you.
Yes, go ahead, Supervisor Bjork.
Thank you. In 2021, if solid waste decides to sell the transfer station plus other equipment, would that money generated, would that go towards balancing the budget for 2021, or would that go towards debt replacement?
That would be up to the county board to decide. Generally, those kinds of proceeds simply go into the general fund. It makes our general fund a little bit more flush, but what we do with that will be driven by where our priorities lie and where our needs lie, whether it's for operational expenses or for capital improvements or for addressing debt. It will be a decision that will need to be made as part of the budget process, should that occur.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Supervisor Leno?
Supervisor Rogers, I guess, was before you, Supervisor Leno, and then Supervisor Bauer. Go ahead, Supervisor Rogers.
So I guess just to make it clear, this is how we raise more revenues, by borrowing instead of raising the tax levy. Am I correct there? And then can you let me know how much per thousand that's going to raise the tax on an individual?
Okay, as the answer to your first question is yes. We can't raise the levy. The levy limit law prohibits us from doing that. It limits us to net new construction, the percent of the total value of net new construction, and we simply haven't had much in the way of net new construction. We've done analyses in the past couple years that have demonstrated over the past 10, 12 years that our net new construction has lagged behind the annual CPI to the effect of 1.5%, which on an individual year doesn't sound like much, but it's cumulative. And so every year we fall a little bit further behind in what we realize in levy compared to our costs. And that's cost of operations and is irrespective of the costs that we encounter with these capital improvements. So yes, the proposal is that the only thing that we've got available to us to fund these projects is borrowing. As for the second thing, I don't know if Keith has had an opportunity yet to work out the what that means per 1,000 of value. I think it's partially driven by what we decide ultimately we are going to do each year. And we will certainly have that information as part of the budget at the end of the year, because the capital plan will be rolled into it.
And Mr. Miller is correct. Yeah, we typically would do that later into the budget process. I have not had the opportunity to do that. There's a lot of variables too that the state of Wisconsin doesn't provide us the information that we'll be using to project tax rates until the middle of August. So right now I'd be using dated information. So it's balancing the timing and the effort for that. Going back to the Supervisor Rogers, your initial question on this, one of the fundamental basic shifts in financing government, local units of government in Wisconsin really occurred with the levy limit freeze. And those that are in the mechanical weeds understand this. It shifted from the ability to, if the local unit of government like Dunn County wanted to levy taxes on a pay-as-you-go type of basis versus borrowing basis, they essentially, over time, that's gone away for the reasons that County Manager mentioned. We're not even receiving enough in our natural growth to cover our operational cost increase, let alone projects. So over the decade plus that this has been in place, it's really forcing a lot of governments that want to keep up on their infrastructure and equipment to have to borrow more than maybe they wanted to, but it's kind of an outcome of the law as it is.
Supervisor Lino, go ahead with your question.
Yeah, I see with the plan to borrow 3 million each year, in light of interest rates being low at this particular time, might it be a better idea to borrow more now with interest rates being more competitive, rather than just doing the same set amount over the next 10 years? That's just an idea that I had. The other thing is also this borrowing is done on a 10-year basis for each one of these chunks of 3 million or whatever is decided.
Okay, I'll let Keith handle the second question, but as to your first one, we each year will have an opportunity to decide, hey, interest rates are low, let's do more than. Or perhaps a project that we had earmarked for year 2 or 3 in the plan becomes an emergency that has to be addressed now, and we really don't have a choice. Bear in mind what this is a plan. A plan is meant to guide, but it is not written in stone. And so each year when we make the decision about the projects that are actually going to be funded and about how much additional debt we are going to take on, we can look at and will look at those very questions. It could be that it's favorable to do more than 3 million in a given year. It could be that it's not favorable to do as much as 3 million. This is intended to give us the flexibility, but the whole point is you try to stick with the plan, because the overall effect of sticking with the plan is to lower our debt limit and gradually, and still allow us to address these capital projects that come along.
And to add to that, you want to keep in mind too that if you keep this stable, your tax rate impact doesn't yo-yo. Again, that's kind of what we've got going on when you have this fiscal volatility. One year you borrow 8 million, then you go a year or two without borrowing, and then you borrow 400,000, then the next year you borrow 12 million. You want to get away from that, because the taxpayers will feel that on their tax bill when you've got this yo-yoing for debt service, which you issue tax levy for. Other factors play into that too, as to, if you plan to borrow $4 or $5 or $6 million, there is IRS laws that require usage within a certain window, so the local governments don't borrow money and sit on it in investments and artificially make money. They have some pretty strict restrictions on usage. Most times it's within 2 or 3 years, depending on the type of debt and the number of years. So there are a number of factors, but certainly Mr. Miller is right. It's intended to be a baseline plan, but then during the budget process later on, we get into the fall and we may find, hey, we need to add another 700,000. We had a roof failure or something like that, the county board decides, okay, so we know our base plan is 3 million, but we have this other urgent need, and you can adjust that at that time or in the next year's plan.
Then the other question was about 10 years.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, Supervisor Lino, that is generally what you would do to get your best rates overall on a routine basis is 10-year.
All right.
20-year is usually for more your significant projects like the neighbors. That $20+ million project was financed over 20 years. Part of that is you get certainty on interest rates, but you also have some interest rate protection. And one of the things that I've always heard from advisors throughout the years is don't chase the market. Set your plans on your need and your plans, and then only adjust to the market if the right opportunity comes along after your baseline is set.
All right, thank you.
Supervisor Bauer, you had a question? And you're muted, Robert. Still muted.
Okay,
There you
most
go.
of my questions I think were answered. Because
Okay.
if we put the money in certain places, you can move it around later, right? Let's say we have that 100-year flood and it takes out many county roads, something. You can pull money, or would you just have to borrow more?
You would have to, that is not a recommended practice. You borrow money for specific projects that are going to be done in that narrow window of time. So if you say you're going to do $2 million worth of road projects, or you say you're going to build a radio tower, you're telling bondholders that's what you're using it for. You don't typically borrow for a rainy day fund, so to speak. That's why we have the reserve funds that we have. If you recall, during budget time and other times of the year, we were poured out on fund balances. That's what that's for. Or if it's significant enough, yes, we'd look for other funding sources such as grants, or we end up having to borrow.
You don't, the people who buy our debt want the assurance of the projects that we identify that debt is for. And so it does pretty much tie us to using it for those purposes.
Supervisor Jensen, you had a question?
Yeah, and in a 5-year term of 3 million per year, would that be an accurate figure that what we would use for infrastructure in those 5 years, or would it run short, or is it just an estimate?
It's a proposal. Does not cover, as you see in the sheets, it doesn't cover everything that our departments have identified as desired or needed capital improvements in the next 5 years. It leaves us shy some $21 million. But the alternative is to borrow even more. Say, hey, we have to get all of these done in 5 years, so we're borrowing more than 3 million. The problem with that, instead of working down our overall debt burden, it's increasing. And what we're trying to do, again, is strike that balance where we're allowing us to address some of these needs, not all, but some of them, and still work down our overall debt burden, our overall debt load. And that's part of what you as supervisors need to think through and provide some guidance. Where is your level of comfort on our total debt? For some, perhaps it is important. Hey, if the managers of the departments have identified these needs, we have to address them. For others, it's, hey, I'm more concerned about what it does to individual property taxpayers to their tax bill, because this debt is paid through by their tax bills. And so I want less than that. That's exactly what we have to come to an agreement on an approach. When the executive committee went through this exercise in February, they settled on this middle of the road approach. 3 million a year allows us to address many projects, not all, over the 5 years, but many of them. But it also allows us to work down that total amount of debt each year.
So then the balance would be paid by the tax levy right now, or not?
Not if we don't borrow enough to pay for all of those projects don't get done.
Any other questions?
Mr. Chair.
Supervisor Kinnear here.
Yes. Go ahead, Supervisor Kinnear.
Thank you. This is a question for Mr. Stray. On your principal payments, I'm just kind of curious what assumptions you made through there as the years go by. If the interest rate went way up in those 5 years, would we still be reducing our debt?
Yes, principal, just like on a home mortgage or any other consumer loan, is just that. That's the baseline. Interest rate is the additional cost. So this, your outstanding balance does not go down based on interest payments. Those are the carrying costs for issuing that debt. So that's more or less the money that you're paying to issue those bonds. It's not the principal. The principal is just repaying what was originally given to you to get the project done. That would play into, however, as we go through this in the budget process and see where the tax rate impact is. over, during the budget process. So it isn't ignored. It just at this point, it's premature because we don't have the information from the state on property values, the net new construction, all of that to give you an accurate tax rate. But certainly that is part of the later part of the budget process.
And the interest rate is usually set when you borrow the money and fixed for the 10 years. So it may go up during that 10 years, but for that issuance of debt, it's going to remain fixed. That's part of the deal we work out. No balloon mortgages in borrowing for capital improvements.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, Supervisor Story.
are we factoring in, well, actually, let's start with this. When was the capital improvements that are listed, when were they put in this proposal? How long ago?
Well, these requests were submitted by departments in late January.
In late January. So if there are things that are forthcoming since then, they haven't been included, or since we've been hearing about them? I guess what I'm referring to is there's been talk of potential rail coming our way, and I'm wondering how that might impact our budget in the future, whenever that's going to be. And I haven't heard any updates on the plan for that. The other one is relative to human services, a building, and actually Diane can maybe say more on this, but I know that they are looking at us joining with others or participating in getting some kind of a building where we would be putting our youth locally rather than taking them to Lincoln Hills or someplace else. And then there might be some budget impact in that. And so I'm wondering if we're factoring any of those kinds of things in that might be mandated things that the government is telling us we have to do, or the county or the state is telling us we might have to do.
We have factored in everything that we're aware of. Part of the approach of a capital improvement plan is it's a rolling plan. So each year, if we are mandated to kick in something related to capital, we adjust the plan to reflect that new mandate. By the way, on the rail, I can tell you the commuter rail, it's unlikely to require the county to pony up for infrastructure.
Okay.
That's just based on my experience with commuter rail. But Lincoln Hills is a good example. That last I heard, the state was still toying with the idea of creating, of requiring regional housing for the youth that would reside in perhaps in one county and have several surrounding counties kicking in funds. That has not been worked out yet, and it begs the question: since every county is under the tax cap, the levy limit law, how are we supposed to come up with this? And the battle over unfunded mandates is one that has gone on as long as I've been in this business. But I'm sure we would have lots of voices. Should the state turn around and just say, find it, we'd have a lot of voices in Madison saying, we can't do it, because that's a multi-million-dollar obligation as well. It remains to be seen what they'll do with that.
Okay.
I guess
Thank you.
the takeaway is, if this capital improvement plan exercise is something we're going to do every year, and it's going to be adjusted every year to the realities that we face, whether it be mandates from the state, federal government, changes on the ground because something that seems stable locally that we have that fell apart or is falling apart, new trends, new priorities that come from future boards, changes to levy laws, whatever else. It's intended to be flexible. It's a rolling 5-year plan that goes on. Hopefully, the effect of this is that it does smooth out that volatility that we've experienced in the past.
Any other questions before we move on? I don't see any. I want to remark to Supervisor Kinnear question about the interest. The interest, as it would go up, would increase our levy, because the interest, the debt service, is over and above our levy limits. So if our over the years, if we borrow $3 million in 3 years from now, the interest is 6% instead of 3%, or it's 8%, it would, borrowing the 3 million would not change our debt service, but the interest rate would cause our levy that we would levy against our residents to pay for that interest would go up. So, if Mr. Stry wants to move on.
You bet. And thank you. All right. Next, we'll get into the actual documents themselves of the CIP.
You're not
that was
sharing.
presented. I'm sorry. Let me backtrack here. Share screen. All right. Is that up?
Yep.
Okay, good. Thank you. All right. So what I'm showing here now is the first page of the actual numbers. So start out with a, in that title at the top of this is in error. It's a summary by year. The first section here is the countywide totals by year. So these are the amounts that were requested in the years that they were identified by the departments. Now, obviously, as part of this process, one of the goals that I've seen historically in my career is you try to balance that out to the extent that makes sense. Again, if our goal is to try to smooth out the economic impact, the impact to the primary goals that we can control, such as tax levy and mainly borrowing under the current levy limit, that's where you start, as you kind of look at that year by year. The middle section here is countywide totals by year and source. So this takes it every year, 2022. Here's the amounts for each of the different funding sources. I will note here, and you'll see it in other spots where I've highlighted it, 2022 in this 5 years, the only year with the projected vehicle registration fees. That fee is expected in the resolution to expire at the end of 2022. So we did not include that in future years. That removes, that was another shift of 2.9 million in highway project funding from vehicle registration fees over to debt.
Now, I will add here, that is unless the board chooses to continue the vehicle registration fee, which would change the formula.
Right. It's just we don't want to assume anything. So, and then finally at the bottom here, we show the countywide totals by source. And these are the two main ones you're talking about, levy and debt. $20.6 million in tax levy is not achievable under the levy limit law. That's just how the request came in. So that'll be part of the process that when staff develops a recommended CIP is bringing it down to what we realistically feel. So then that results in where do we find additional money? Do we put it in borrowing or do we find grants or otherwise? But this is just how the requests were submitted. So again, the total is 46.5 million. So that's a summary page. And then the final detail with all the individual requests by department. The first one, let's see here, let me slide it down here, page down. Okay. All right. All right, this first one is the detailed summary by department. And really it does, for example, the first one that's shown here is the land and water conservation. And it shows the 3 projects they have listed, the year, the project, or the equipment in this case, dollar amount and funding sources. And then off to the right is here where they explain in summary what they're trying to do, what they're doing. So that's this section. So it's taking each department's request and goes through it. Let me go down to the last one. Okay, then the next section is request by department and year, and it just puts it in a different format. So what I mean by that is, in this case, it gives it by department division, but instead of the additional justification, it just takes each project and shows which year it's funded and the dollar amount. So it's slicing and dicing and presenting the information in different fashions. So people look at things differently, and this was one way to look at it from that perspective. So that is the balance of the information presented in the packet. I'm not going to go through each of these individually. We got these out to the supervisors a week in advance of the meeting. Hopefully everybody's had a chance to take a look at those. And if you can, I guess we'll turn it over now for any questions or observations or feedback that you have on the requests or any other things you'd like to cover on this. The intent tonight is, again, to present the information, go over it, and then give you some time to give us feedback. We did ask that in putting together a recommended plan for the executive committee consideration on the 14th, that the county manager or I receive feedback from supervisors no later than April 5th, as I mentioned in my cover memo. That'll give us time to pull all that together, factor all that in as we try to put together a recommended 5-year plan. So with that, I'll turn it over for questions or feedback. Stop sharing.
Thank you. All right. Are there any questions? Supervisor Lino.
Yes, I noticed on budget time period, I think it was 2024, about demolition of a tower. I'm not quite sure why we have to do that, or, you know, is this thing that we've been told that it's got to come down, that kind of thing?
No, Supervisor Lino, that's the, I believe it's the smokestack for the old healthcare center. That building is not being used. It is getting worse every year, has gotten worse. It's the old boiler room stuff. If you looked earlier in this proposal, there was money the year before that to abate it with all the asbestos and stuff, and then those buildings would be removed. And that's what that is about.
So that's just total demolition then, is what you're talking.
That's the way I believe, yes.
I just thought it was pretty expensive.
Well, our highway department is expensive, so we'll have to, but maybe, you know, those are estimates too, so.
And part of our obligation, it's not something that we often think about when it comes to capital improvements, but there is a life on these. And part of our obligation is to see the proper disposal when any of our facilities has reached end of life and becomes an attractive nuisance and a potential danger. I mean, we could leave these buildings up until they fall down on their own, but that's not very good stewardship of the county's resources.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions? Supervisor Score.
What about the old highway shop and stuff? Is that gonna fall down before we do something about it?
I hope not. I think there was something in the budget for a roof or something.
There is in 2022 identified for a highway shop roof replacement.
Yeah, we did some patching on the roof last year. It's holding pretty well. We like the way it looks. We think we'll be able to put it off for a year or two, but we do need a new roof for the highway shop.
Okay, I think Supervisor Score was asking about our old highway shop, and I thought I read something in there about one of those buildings also, but maybe I'm wrong.
And bear in mind too, when we generate this list, it is something that, again, we will be going to the managers each year for them to update what they see as their capital needs, whether it's construction, repair, maintenance, improvement, or demolition. And we rely upon those experts to know the status of these capital improvements and to give us fair warning, advance warning, before something becomes a crisis of something that's needed. That becomes part of the push and pull each year of where we lay our priorities given limited funding resources.
Any other questions?
Chair Bartlett.
Our CFO, Mr. Straya, has a question.
Actually, not a question. I did want to
Oh.
piggyback on the timing question too on this, because I've heard this through the years that, the county board, if you adopt a plan, like a situation like that, like Paul was just talking about, where, okay, in April, you say, this is your plan for the year, and you try to plan for the 2022 budget, in this case, for the next budget. That doesn't mean things can't change. For example, if I think this goes to Supervisor Story's question, at least part of it is, if a new development comes along in the budget process and it's communicated to us, certainly we have an obligation. We will present that to you as a consideration for inclusion. So if we hear back, this is the starting point from the information presented at this time, but if something rapidly changes or a new opportunity comes along, we will build that into the budget process later on. This is just a starting point to get a baseline of information. I think that's important to point out because it's not intended to be in concrete, but it certainly gives you a basic roadmap, because assuming you adopt this in April, then that will be what departments will be expected to use to put together their budget requests in May and June for us to present in July. But again, we still can change if something comes up.
Any other questions? I can't see everybody at once, so if there's somebody who has a question, please speak up.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, just to prompt perhaps to, you don't necessarily have to do this tonight, but I find for myself in particular, use the last spreadsheet that Keith provided to us, which identifies in columns the year and then the department and then the project. If you've not had an opportunity to review that, I encourage you to do so, because that's one area where you, in your role as supervisors, you want to be aware of what we've earmarked for each year and what is being earmarked for subsequent years. And if you have a priority or a question about why is this being done at that year instead of earlier or later, or is something really necessary, or there's something I'm aware of and I don't see it on this list, that would be a good time between now and April 5 for you to contact staff and make that known. So you might want to focus in on that spreadsheet in particular with respect to that. The other thing that you want to do, if you haven't already, is think about the overall approach that we're taking. Do you agree with the approach of aiming at 3 million in additional borrowing every year as a reasonable midpoint between doing nothing for capital improvements and doing everything for capital improvements? Are you comfortable with what that may mean, even understanding that, yes, as each year comes along, we're going to have to come up with more detail about those projects and about the impact on individual property owners, tax bills, the cost per 1,000, things of that nature. So also give some thought, some consideration to those broader approaches that we've presented here tonight. And if you have ideas or thoughts or questions or concerns or suggestions between now and April 5, please contact Keith, contact me, and let us know so that we can factor that in as well. What we hope to do next is, in fact, pull together a draft a CIP to present to the executive committee at its meeting in April 7th, I think it is, in time for it's April 14th, in time for the county board meeting on the 21st for actual adoption. So that's why we've kind of asked for that April 5 deadline for your input, so that we can factor that into that plan we're going to pull together. In the end, you'll get a chance to act on that plan at the regularly scheduled April meeting of the county board. And again, it is not even then necessarily written in stone. As Keith just said, if something comes up, an emergency that must be addressed. And by the way, here's something that's looming out there that we did not factor in because we don't know, and that is the American Recovery Act money. Presumably, Dunn County, I've heard, has been earmarked for nearly $9 million. Problem is we don't know what we can use it for. And we are attending as many of these webinars and informational presentations as we can, waiting to figure out. Initially, some of the indication is that that money may be allowed to be used for capital improvements, which begs the question, which capital improvements? And we've already heard maybe only certain types, but it's still very much up in the air. So much so that it would have been ill-advised to factor that money in for tonight's presentation. But that's an example of something that's waiting out there that could significantly impact what our capital improvement plan, 5-year plan adopted, ends up looking like. We won't have that. We may not have that information, probably won't for April, but hopefully will before we adopt the budget in November. So that's a good example of something that's out there. We're aware of it, we're tracking it, and we'll see what impact it has on our final decisions.
When you mention that you're going to bring a plan to executive and to the county board, this is a 5-year capital plan
Yes.
that's coming. All right. I apologize again that I was not at executive this last month when I was sick, but executive did decide to advise for the $3 million. The one thing I want to bring up is I've heard from numerous supervisors about the budget process, and that the executive committee seems to have a lot more power than the rest of the supervisors towards the budget. Now, I'm not totally agree with that, but keeping that in mind, I want you all to consider what this plan is going to be, because we're going to vote on this plan at our April meeting of the county board. And if there's any information that you would like outstanding debt, so there's a lot of information in our green books that we got from WCA. And if you don't have one of those, it's probably in your mailbox. So I'm reminding people to come and pick those up, because I've noticed there's quite a bit of stuff there. And I know that there is still some green books in there, but that'll show you where Dunn County is compared to other counties with per capita debt. Lots of information about debt in there. But if there's any information that you would like to help try to make your decision on at our April County Board meeting, don't be afraid to ask. If I can't find it, I will try to find someone that can find that information. When it comes to long-term debt, payments of interest payments and principal, that is now. So you know what it's going to do to change if we borrow $3 million a year. So that's my intention moving forward. And it sounds like my intention is the same as the administration's. Any other questions before we adjourn?
Well, we actually have one other item to discuss.
Oh, Supervisor Rogers. Sorry.
It's okay.
Go ahead, Supervisor Rogers.
So thank you. So Keith, is there any chance you could let us know what raising our debt from 1 million last year or borrowing to 3 million, the $2 million, how much that $2 million will affect the property taxes per thousand? just
can
as
do-
a kind of a ballpark idea?
I can do a ballpark and I will send that out. It may take me a few days, maybe early next week, but yeah, I can throw something together. It'll be dated information, but it'll give you a general sense, I believe is what you're looking for.
Thank you.
All right, if.
I have a question.
Supervisor Jensen, go ahead.
Yeah, if we did get 9 million in funding, is it still necessary then to fulfill a $3 million increase every year in our financing?
It'll depend totally on what the rules are for getting that $9 million. It's eight point something million dollars worth of funding. We may not be able to use it for whatever we would like. So we'll have to see what the guidelines are with that. And that we may get up to that, but maybe we can't spend all that with the guidelines that they give us. We'll just have to wait and see what happens. If there are no other questions moving forward, I didn't have my agenda in front of me, and we have one more thing. We have moving down to item number 5. So who wants to take the county manager? Mr. Miller will take that.
Thank you. The last item in your packet of materials concerns prioritization of county services, programs, and departments. 2 years ago, those of you who are on the board will recall, we had a workshop and went through an exercise where we attempted to prioritize departments and divisions and programs, recognizing that our finances are flat or declining and our costs are going up, and that we cannot sustain the level of service that we have traditionally provided to the residents of Dunn County under the constraints imposed upon us by the state with respect to levy, which is how the majority of these services and programs are financed outside of grants. So we went through an exercise where we actually applied a priority ranking, a 1 for highest priority, a 2 or a 3 to every department and division and the major programs within the various departments. For instance, human services consisting of programs, economic support and family and children services and ADRC, et cetera, or the sheriff, which is both patrol and jail, or public works, which is highway and facilities and transit. We actually applied prioritization, and without intending it, we found ourselves right away with a need to use that prioritization to make tough decisions about levels of service and in fact sustaining programs. We ended up, because it had received a priority 3, our home care program, we made the painful decision to cease that program as an effort to balance our budget and recognizing that we simply could not sustain the level of service. What I provided in your packet was the worksheets that we used in that prioritization in 2019. The first page listing the departments and the divisions and the programs. The second page talking about level of service options, things that we could do to potentially reduce levels of service and thereby reduce costs. And then the final one was a listing of the various programs and what they cost us, for the various departments in terms of levy, how they're paid for, and what they're running us to run those programs, to provide those services. What I asked you to do for this exercise was revisit these, and I'm not looking for us to go through another exercise where we rank everything. But I am asking if you have had an opportunity to look at these, can we identify where staff should turn its attention should we find ourselves in a similar situation for 2022, where should we turn our attention with an eye toward cuts, an eye toward reductions in levels of service so that we can have a balanced budget? If we find that we cannot and do not have the revenue, remember, we can't borrow for operations. So what we're talking about is levy, and what's driving this is the levy limit law. In particular, you may want to focus on the page that talks about how we can adjust levels of service. For instance, under administration, and I'm not saving administration, my department, from anything, but under administration, ideas like contracting out financial services, HR services, IT services, eliminating the CJCC, or even contracting out your county manager. These aren't necessarily things we want to do, any of them. In fact, we don't want to do. We've observed for many years, there's nothing that the county does, there's no services we provide which are superfluous and unappreciated and unnecessary. But when you cannot do everything, you have to identify what it is that you're not going to do. If you've not had an opportunity to review those level of service examples, I encourage you to do so. If you have, I encourage you to reach out to us, either speak up now or reach out to staff afterwards. And if you have your own ideas about how we can reduce costs, how we might change or reduce levels of service, how we might, what we might eliminate if we have to eliminate something. What do you consider, if anything has to be cut, what should it be? That's what we need to hear. We need guidance from you, our supervisors. So it's not driven entirely by staff. This is the tough decisions that you as elected officials have to make. And this is the direction that we need. So I don't know if anybody has any thoughts right now that they want to share with everybody.
Supervisor Bjork.
Thank you. Just going on what Mr. Miller was saying, since the neighbors is a big part of our debt, and there is a big part of our minus on the budget, is that something that should maybe be looked at? These are tough decisions, but that's one of the major part of the debt, and it's also part of the budget. That's all losing money.
We have listed in that level of service examples. We could talk about selling or leasing the neighbor's operation. We could talk about permanently closing houses. There are consequences to these things as well. You'll remember in the prioritization exercise, Supervisor Bjork, we talked about how these prioritizations represent the values of the board collectively. And the neighbors was given a middle ranking of 2. So it wasn't the highest priority, but it wasn't identified as lowest priority. Would another group of people consider it as important, more important, less important? I don't know. But yes, that's on the table. Everything is on the table, because the fact remains, if we find ourselves, we cannot afford everything. What do we choose to do less of, or what do we choose to stop doing? That's the question.
Supervisor Steen.
Yes, I'd like to respond to Mr. Miller's statements here. I'm assuming that everything's on the table, but I haven't heard anything about going to referendum, increasing our ability to pay for things. That's an option. I'm not saying it's a good option, but when you talk about values for the county and what do our supervisors think is important, perhaps the supervisors can think about what do they want to offer the people. And the thing to remember about all levels of government, it's a service. We're not a business, it's a service. It costs us money. And I, for one, am very hesitant to go much further on the things that we don't deliver. And I would appreciate that the rest of the supervisors would give this a thought, because eventually we can't cut ourselves to success. With the current setup, with the reimbursements from the state government, every level of government, counties included, are cannibalizing themselves. And we've already seen a large increase in referendums coming from school districts. And it appears to me that townships, villages, cities, and counties are headed in the same direction. So I think that's an option that hasn't been discussed. I don't know if it's a good option, but it is an option and would allow us to maintain the level of service that we think is important. Just something for us to think about, rather than continually asking for what we can cut and where we can save money. Not that I'm against saving money, but we got to remember, government is a service, not a business. We should have good business practices, but we're not in existence to make money. We're in existence to give our people the services they need. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Supervisor Morehouse.
I was essentially going to raise the same issue that Supervisor Steen has raised so eloquently, so I won't belabor the point. But I would sure love to see some revenue generating options. We have talked about attaching CPI to the levy. I mean, so let us consider some things that are not just, as Supervisor Steen points out, cannibalizing our own level of service.
We will put that on our agenda for executive. Any other questions?
Mr. Chair,
Supervisor Story.
have we looked at this with regards to where we are at with our directional plan, sustainability? Has that all been discussed as well? That's question one. And question two is there broadband listed anywhere? I didn't see anything.
I didn't see anything in broadband, and as far as the directional plan, I think we've always tried to keep that in mind when we make decisions, but we are going through the broadband. All committees are going through that right now and updating it, so that should be foremost on our mind also.
And I will add that on the directional plan, we're not only addressing the policy, crafting policies on the initiatives that are there, we have the opportunity to add new ones. And fiscal sustainability, it sounds like a really good one to add to our directional plan because it isn't overtly in there at this time. Broadband is part of the directional plan. You don't see it in the exercise that we have here because at this point, there's no proposal to earmark any funds by the county for broadband, which isn't to say we can't add it. It would be an additional expenditure, and it would beg the question, where's those funds coming from? But it is not part of the exercise for that reason. It hasn't been a proposed project.
Any other questions?
Mr. Chair, Supervisor Headland.
Supervisor Headland, go ahead.
Yeah, and I would like to applaud everybody for their concerns and nice common sense approach. And I guess I'd just like to add my thoughts to that common sense approach. And that is that we also have to think about the fact that we don't want to become the county that's the top in the Green Book as far as tax levy per capita income. And we don't live in a county that has a very high per capita income. And so anytime we talk about going to the well for more money from the taxpayers, we have to remember who really that well is. That's the people who have elected us to serve them. And so I think we want to give them all the services we possibly can, but we also can't break the bank and overburden those people in paying for things that then at that point we have to shut down because nobody can afford to pay them. So we have to keep that in mind if we want to attract people to Dunn County. If we want to attract people to come here to businesses, and we want people to stay here who are talented and can work here, we cannot overburden them with tax payments either. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Supervisor Jensen.
Yes, I was wondering what we're doing to grow our way out of this a little bit by innovating things to bring new business to Dunn County.
If you're talking about economic development efforts, Supervisor Jensen, that is something that's been in flux here this past year, but the signs are looking up. We have the Dunn County Economic Development Corporation, which has brought on a new executive director who is a professional in economic development. We've got the Greater Menominee Development Corps, which has contracted with Cedar Corps and is actually engaging in economic development activities, which is outreach to existing buildings, existing businesses rather, find out their needs, their plans for expansion, their plans for remaining, and where opportunities exist for bringing in new businesses that will help with their supply chain or their transportation, their manufacturing, their production. And we'll begin reaching out to the various development sectors to market Dunn County in terms of its available resources, its location between two urban centers, its available land, its infrastructure, et cetera. So economic development activities are looking up. It is something that the county is participating in. We are members of both the Dunn County EDC and the Greater Menominee Development Corporation. So those efforts are being made and they are important. And that's what we're doing in terms of that. Is there more that we can be doing? Absolutely. The track record, and this is not my opinion, it's what I've been told, the track record of economic development has not been great in the past couple of decades, but the trend, in my opinion, this is my opinion, is looking up.
Yeah, I'm a firm believer in moving forward. If you're not moving one direction and you're at a standstill, expenses will start eating you up.
Thank you. Any other questions? I don't see any. And nobody seems to be speaking up. So I think we are done with our agenda tonight.
If we can get any feedback then from supervisors on the prioritization or ideas for reduced services, or as Supervisor Steen brought up, ideas for increased revenues, again, by the 5th, you can contact me, our CFO, Keith Stray, between now and then. With any ideas that you have, we promise that we will listen and list them. And if we can get those at the same time, we can factor that in as well.
Anything else before we adjourn?
Mr. Chair,
Supervisor Story.
just to clarify, would that, Paul, mean above and beyond what was discussed tonight that you haven't already heard about, or do we need to redirect that in an email to you? Anything that we might have thought about?
Anything at all, whether it's something that we've covered tonight or an idea that has occurred to you before or that will occur to you, in the next couple of days. Any ideas at all regarding not only the capital improvement plan, which projects we should be financing at which rate and at what amount, but also again on these prioritizations of our services and programs and evaluation of our levels of service and ideas for generating revenue. Any and all of that occurs to you, please contact us. You feel free to call, but emails are always appreciated because they help you put your thoughts in order and give us a clearer notion of what you have in mind.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair?
Yes. Supervisor Steen.
Along with what Paul just talked about the economic development, I plan to meet with Paul and Keith Stray here the next week. I have some proposals as it regards economic development. I'm the president of the Dunn County Economic Development Corporation. We do have a new man. we are going in the right direction. He did work here before. He had a successful track record. And I would concur with Paul that we're going in the right direction, but I'll be sharing my ideas with Paul and Keith and see how they are evaluated.
All right, thank you. Anything else before we adjourn? I don't see anything, so we're officially